Okay, well, hi everyone, and thank you so much to you all for joining us. For this is the second of our series on media landscape and place. Sorry, landscape, pace, and participatory media. So if you've missed the first one of these, I'll be putting the recording up onto our website, so you should be able to download it later on in the month. Although there's very little month left. Today, we're delighted to host. We can't host for two reasons. One, it's virtual, and two, because he's one of us. But we're delighted to hear today from Tom Martin, who's one of our research as practice colleagues, who's a participatory photographer, who's a participatory project practitioner and academic. He specializes in creating meaningful images about humanitarian issues through photography and video. And although he tends to work with large organizations and donors, his interest is primarily in the people and communities that he collaborates with. And that's obviously why he's been invited to be part of the series. His participatory media work it has humanitarian issues, but people lie at the heart of it, and the communities and the connections between them. His academic research practice explores participatory photography projects in post-conflict environments, working towards creative approaches that address both the roots of conflict and the inherent power relationships in the development sector. Today, he's going to talk to us a bit more broadly about his work in photography, and starting off with the ambitious question that I'm dying to know the answer to, of what is participatory photography. So I will mute myself and hand over to you, Tom.
Great, thanks, Andrew, for that introduction. So something that Andrew and I were just briefly chatting about before we got started today as well was thinking about, because I can see a lot of colleagues here, people that work primarily as practitioners within academia, and actually bridging that gap between having a practice and working in a practice-based context and research is something that I've been working on and been really interested in kind of looking into, is how to transform that experience as a practitioner into ways of generating new knowledge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that with my photographic practice and how that's kind of come about, and also my kind of experience in discovering some very practical methodologies to be able to do that as well, and how exciting that was. I don't normally read from scripts, but today, because I've got such an esteemed audience, I thought that I would probably make sure that it does all make sense and is coherent in order. So I'm going to be reading from a script, but I've wrote this especially for you, so don't feel like you're not getting my full attention. So a bit about me originally. So I'm a documentary photographer, and I've spent my career mostly working with development organisations, charities and NGOs in a variety of different contexts, from organisations like the United Nations, the European Commission, through to smaller peace-building organisations, and in a range of different contexts. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the roots of the practice of participatory photography and some information about the ethical and critical challenges that we face with the practice. Then I'm going to quickly go over a case study for a project that I ran in South Sudan with a group of people in a community back in 2013, which was just before the civil war in South Sudan kind of restarted. And I was there at that time as well, so I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to give a bit of insight into how these projects can function and how we can work with different communities that are at risk to generate new knowledge. So first of all, that burning question that Andrew pointed out, what is participatory photography? And I like to be direct, so I thought I'd address that straight away. So participatory photography aims to bring people together to identify and engage with the challenges that their community face, creating photographs to record and share their experience. It's rooted in the emancipatory approach of the Brazilian educational theorist Paolo Freire. If there are any Brazilians in the room or anybody that speaks Portuguese, please correct me, because there's quite a few different different approaches to pronouncing Freire, but that's what I've settled on. So in these projects, people are equipped with cameras and the skills to use them, and they're then asked to record what they see. A crucial element of the participatory process is the dialogue around the images that the participants share, and through this dialogue, we can develop an insight and knowledge around the subjects that they choose, and it's this dialogue that can act as a catalyst for change. So a key aim of the Freirean participatory project is to speak to oppressive power relationships and empower participants to visualize and share their problems from their own perspective. So there are some issues around how we understand and define these power relationships, which I'm going to cover in a little bit more detail. But I'm also going to look at some of the common challenges that are often faced when working in this way, and some of the established critical arguments around participatory photography. Organisations use photographs produced by participatory projects in different ways. It could be to communicate their activities, advocate for a cause, or it could be part of a wider monitoring and evaluation process. Participatory photography projects are also used to directly benefit participants in their communities, and I think that's a really crucial element of how these projects work. So the process of making images itself can facilitate dialogue, and the sharing and exhibiting of these images enables participants to see and discuss situations from alternative points of view. The process is often applied within peace-building projects, which is where most of my experience is situated. In these contexts, participatory photography projects are often used as ways of developing relationships within communities that are at risk of conflict. And that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about from the work that I did in South Sudan. So Paolo Freire questions the role of the educator and the power relationships associated with the top-down nature of traditional educational methods. He puts forward a basis for an approach to education as a practice of freedom, creating a set of theories and practices which can be used to develop emancipatory approaches to education. In his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was published in 1970, and Education for Critical Consciousness in 1972, these books have influenced generations of educators, and his emancipatory pedagogy is based on learning being activated by politically engaged two-way dialogue. And it's this dialogic process that informs the ideal of the participatory photography process. So key to this radical emancipatory approach is a process called conscientization, through which learners critically reflect on the situation of their everyday life, questioning and intervening in their reality. And it's through a process of discussion and inquiry that learners begin to become aware or conscious of the contradictions in the way they live, contradictions that may have been previously invisible in daily familiarity. And it's this process that increases their ability to become critically aware of themselves, their community, and a wider social environment in which they're situated. It's by engaging in these collaborative processes that the participants engage in reflective two-way dialogue. It's this emancipatory power of this dialogue that forms the basis of Freire's ideas, and from which participatory photography projects emerge. Participatory photography projects, it's always a mouthful. I've never got used to getting those three words out in a row. But participatory photography projects aim to adapt and evolve this Freirean dialogic approach, disrupting the one-way nature of representation, especially in the NGO environment. So in the NGO environment, often, I certainly felt like as a freelance photographer visiting communities that I represent a power rooted in the global north. And whichever way you kind of look at it, I'm still somebody from the global north working for a development organization, photographing people who are having projects happen in their community. That's something which I really struggled with as a practitioner over the years. And it wasn't really until I moved into academia that I was able to start really exploring those problems and those paradoxes that I was having when I was working purely as a freelance photographer. And that's really when I started looking at these emancipatory and participatory approaches to working with communities to sort of challenge some of those power dynamics that are inherent in the process. So NGOs aim, or non-government organisations aim to enable their beneficiaries to become responsible for representing and therefore empowering themselves, creating visual material that opens a window into their world. American academics Caroline Wang and Mary Ann Burris pioneered the use of participatory photography in the NGO environment. Initially, they observed the use of these Freirean processes in a public health education project in Albuquerque in the USA. By engaging with material collaboratively, Participants were able to think critically about their community, engaging with a wider political conversation. Wang and Boris adapted these ideas when they were developed in a project in the Yunnan province with a project called Photo Voice. This was a project with the Reproductive Health and Development Programme, and they were the first to define the methodology Photo Voice in their paper Photo Voice Concept, Methodology and Use for Needs Assessment in 1997. The context of their application was a form of needs assessment in a much larger public health project. By taking this visual and collaborative approach, they were able to engage the communities that they were working with and defining how they themselves should be helped. This methodology has since been adapted and used around the world in countless situations. So there are problems with the method, and an array of issues have been unearthed by research into the use of participatory photography in the development sector, and sometimes revealing the process to be ethically complex, replete with tensions, paradoxes, and power struggles. And that's Tiffany Freire. Participatory photography projects are used as qualitative tools to monitor, evaluate, and communicate the strategies and projects implemented by NGOs. However, they often fail to address the inherently political nature of the organisations through which they are commissioned. Critics also identify that the methods used to implement projects may often limit the ability for participants to be creative and more critically aware of the world around them. As power dynamics in the NGO sector have become increasingly complicated and conflicted, there's been a drift away from the Freirean objective of emancipation through critical consciousness. I've come to notice that participatory projects often fall short of their aims to empower and emancipate participants, as the promise of inverting traditional power hierarchies is frequently limited by the practical methods. Limited by the practical methods used, not addressing the wider political context in which the projects take place. And this often relates to the historical context of international development aid and the work of NGOs, emerging from a colonial legacy. How post-colonialism links to capitalism within a global neoliberal environment. And I believe that there's an inherent paradox in participatory photography projects between fixed managerial processes and the promise to find freedom through inquiry and expression. So these are some of the challenges that I identified when I was working with various organisations running participatory projects before I moved into academia, and since then I kind of investigated these through my MA by research, and looked at these different projects and looked at these processes and tried to identify some of those challenges, and went about addressing them and developing a method or a different approach, which I tested in Rwanda as part of that study. So if you're interested in those approaches to participatory photography and different ways of looking at some of those challenges and those paradoxes and power struggles, let me know, and I can send over a link to a short video about a project that I ran in Kigali at the Kigali Genocide Memorial Centre, which was aimed at addressing some of those challenges in quite a practical way. And it's quite an interesting project. It's only a 10-minute video as well, so yeah, it's not a big thing to look at. So the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is a case study from South Sudan. So this was a project back in 2013, and the reason I'm showing this to you is because it kind of quite neatly explains how the process works and how it can be used to reach communities and to gain an insight into the experience of the people that are being worked with. So yeah, in 2013, I facilitated a participatory photography project in South Sudan, working with communities at risk of conflict. The project was implemented with the NGO Safer World as part of a large peace-building project using their community security approach, which they developed and defined. So I travelled to a remote town called Kwajok in northern South Sudan to facilitate the project. South Sudan is the world's youngest country, having been formed in 2011. And when I first visited there in 2012, the country was just 1 year old. South Sudan's had a turbulent past, with decades of civil war leading to serious tensions between various political and ethnic groups in society, combined with political power battles for mineral and oil resources. Since its independence, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has advised against all travel to South Sudan. This is a very Western view of South Sudan, identifying it as a no-go area. The NGO Safer World has been operating in the region since 2002, and they work with members of the community, local authorities, civil society partners, and hard-to-reach groups such as young people, women, and non-state security providers. Working with these groups, they identify and address safety and peace-building needs that are specific to the different communities. So they developed and defined the community security approach to peace building. So at the heart of the community security approach is the concept of human security, defined in the influential 1994 United Nations Development Programme Human Development Report, the HDR. And this HDR report outlines that security is a universal entitlement, which is required as a fundamental foundation for all human well-being, and is a prerequisite for all other forms of development. The HDR report calls for a new definition of security away from a national perspective onto a human scale, which should be addressed and approached with people at its centre. So Safer World are a really interesting organisation because a lot of the work that they do is actually around knowledge production and about gathering information, producing qualitative research around specific groups, and then that information is then used to influence policy making. So, you know, from my experience, this was before I worked at the university. A lot of the work that I was doing was with organisations like this that were actually seeking to inform policy. So the capacity to have impact is actually quite great and have real impact with various groups. Although the images that I was making weren't necessarily for sort of public or general consumption. I would be often working with researchers alongside them, helping them to produce studies and things that would work as advocacy material for various situations. So, and Safer World is an organisation that works along those lines. So their community security approach aims to directly tackle issues causing insecurity at a community level. It does this through a person-centred approach, aiming to directly improve the relationships between and behaviours of communities, authorities and institutions. This process provides individual actors with opportunities to identify their security concerns, then plan appropriate collective responses and actions. Ultimately, it aims to empower communities to hold to account those who should be delivering their security. Safer World Executive Director Paul Murphy defines community security in the 2014 Community Security Handbook. And he says, community security affirms the need for institutional and technical reforms, but rejects the idea that security is the sole preserve of the state. The public is engaged as having both the right and the opportunity to articulate security priorities and to be part of planning and implementing responses. So it's within the context of a wider community security programme that the Kujok Participatory Photography Project was established. There are many ideological resonances between the emancipatory promise of the participatory photography process and the promise of the community security approach to empower communities to hold those in power to account. The commonality of the rejection of top-down politics links with these approaches. In this context, the use of participatory photography projects allows participants to identify the issues that affect them, open a dialogue in their community, and to feed that information back up the power chain, enabling voices to be heard and enabling positive social change. The format of participatory photography projects in Kujok followed a typical method. Safer World identified that a participatory project would fit within their wider community security programme in the region as part of a range of focus groups and community interventions. And they were working with local partners to assess how security issues could be addressed. In the terms of reference for the project, Safer will define their position and objectives, such as we work with local people affected by conflict to improve their safety and sense of security and conduct wider research and analysis. We use this evidence and learning to improve national, local and international policies and practices that can help build lasting peace. From this mission statement, we can ascertain that the organisation aims to simultaneously directly improve the security of the participants, while also generating insight and subsequently advocacy material to be used to influence policymakers. This is further explained in the overall project aims in the TOR. So the project goals. The overall aims of the Participatory Photography Project are to involve communities and build their sense of ownership of the wider community, safety and security projects being carried out by Safer World and partners, provide first-hand visual and audio material for individual and community concerns over safety and security. And this will be useful for communications, funding, and for national international advocacy work. And then to provide a baseline for follow-on regular 6-monthly updates with identified individuals, providing stories of change and impact. This will be useful for communications, funding, advocacy, and monitoring and evaluation. So staff from a local partner organisation helped to select the participants. They included those that hold power in the community, such as police and members of the security forces, and representatives of vulnerable people, such as local journalists and respected elders. The range of participants selected was in part designed to bring them together, as there's often poor communication and tension between these groups. The participants are also in a position to be able to offer a level of insight into the various issues that affect the community, which was really useful for the evaluation and advocacy aims of the project. So in the training element of the project, basic technical skills were delivered so that participants were able to use cameras, methods of visualizing stories, and understanding how to communicate ideas through image making. It was at this point that the subject of the images to be taken was also given to the participants, and it was to create images that show what safety and security means to them. Safer World had predefined this subject at the beginning of the project because the purpose of the project was to directly link issues around safety and security. And this directive approach was taken to define the subject to be photographed. It was also made clear that this was not the purpose of the project to create images of violence, insecurity, or conflict, and in no way were the participants able to put themselves in any danger when creating the images. During the training, participants were given 2 hours to complete a practical task, to go into the town and collect images that showed someone or something that needed protection. It was emphasised that it didn't necessarily mean to photograph vulnerable people, as often people in positions of power also require protection. After the image collection, the participants would return, download their images, and begin a discussion with the rest of the group about their content. So after a 2-hour period, the participants started to return, and we started to download the images. It quickly became apparent that the quality and content of the images had exceeded the expectations of myself as a facilitator and the staff working for Safer World. This was the first participatory project that I've been involved with, and for the preceding 7 years I've been struggling to gain a level of insight and understanding into the issues affecting communities like these, carrying the burden of a practitioner wrestling with the fundamental issues of authentic representation in a post-colonial NGO environment. The participants in Kwajok had managed to gain access to their community and create a set of images that showed the issues that affected them with seemingly more depth and authenticity than I could possibly achieve as a Western outsider. With just a morning's training and 2 hours collecting images, for me, documentary photography in the NGO context would never be the same again. They returned with a range of images that covered a surprisingly diverse and engaging set of topics. A participant who was a policeman decided to document the struggle of children displaced by the conflict who had no family to help and support them, and they were regularly forced to steal food from the market to survive. He photographed the young boys after they had been caught by the police and beaten. The policeman found the situation distressing as he was also forced to catch and punish these young people, although he knew what they really needed was support that wasn't available. A participant who was a soldier photographed an ex-child soldier who was suffering from serious mental health problems due to the trauma from the conflict. In a country with a long history of endemic conflict and no support for ex-combatants, this is a common situation. A female journalist who was a participant photographed women who were being imprisoned because their husbands had not paid the marriage dowry due to the family. The journalists have been trying to raise awareness of this injustice. Each of these issues would have been very hard to research as an outsider, let alone negotiate access to photograph and represent them. In that moment, the participatory photography project seemed to be like a magical silver bullet for the ethical paradoxes at the heart of representation in the NGO environment. Tasking the people who understand their own situation best with identifying problems and documenting them from their own perspective seemed like a simple solution. Over time, I realised that participatory projects can be just as ethically paradoxical as traditional documentary processes, drawing the participants into an even more complicated political relationship. But there's also a new path to challenge these ethical issues. So these are the images, or a selection of the images taken by the participants in South Sudan, in Kujok. So in terms of the benefits of participatory photography, this is a selection of the possible benefits. In terms of the aims set out by Safer World, the project was a success. The first aim was to involve communities to build their sense of ownership of the wider community safety and security. So actually to directly assist and stimulate a sense of community within the people that we were working with. Community elders were surprised to hear that the police were uncomfortable with arresting and punishing young people who had no choice but to steal food. Conversely, the police were grateful for a forum where they could share their frustrations and show that they understood the complexities of the situation. When the female journalist explained the injustice in women being imprisoned to punish their husbands, there was a discussion about how matters of gender equality could be approached in the community. The images themselves formed a central point of these discussions. From this, we can ascertain that the first aim of the project was a success. The second aim of the project was to provide first-hand visual and oral material of individual and community concerns over safety and security. Safer World now have a body of material they can draw upon directly to communicate the security concerns of those living in this region of South Sudan. The third aim of the project was to provide a baseline for follow-on regular 6-monthly updates with identified individuals providing stories of change and impact. So unfortunately, shortly after I left South Sudan, or as I was leaving, a new civil war started again. There were tensions between various political and ethnic groups, but a strong sense of optimism for the future of this new country. The town of Kujok was on the front line of this conflict, and many of the people I had met and worked with in the project were displaced, and it was not possible for me to return, and it wasn't possible for the project to continue. However, the cameras are still out there, and perhaps they're still being used. Here's a brief overview of the possible benefits of participatory photography projects, which I've broken down into 3 groups. So it's actually therapeutic benefits, which directly benefit the individuals involved in the projects, evaluative processes, so things such as processes such as needs assessment within communities, reporting back on projects, monitoring and evaluation and collecting data, and then also as an advocacy tool, could be a call for action, making voices heard within communities and raising awareness of important social and cultural issues. And there's lots of benefits and sides to these projects which overlap as well. Just a quick look at some of the key figures in participatory photography. Paolo Freire, whose theories form the basis of the ideas behind the practice. Caroline Wang and Marianne Burris, who actually developed the first photo voice methodology. And more recently, Tiffany Ferry, who was the founder of the NGO Photo Voice in the United Kingdom. And has worked with NGOs across the world producing participatory projects. And for her PhD at Goldsmiths, very eloquently kind of deconstructed the practice, and she's now working at King's College in London. I think she's got a big Leverhulme grant. She's developing the practice further as well. And that's the end of my slideshow and the end of my the end of my talk.